Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating argument from Georges Tarabishi's work about a huge shift in Islamic history, what he calls the move from an Islam of the Quran to an Islam of the Hadith. So, how are we going to map this whole journey? Well, we'll walk through 5 key stages. We're going to start with the 2 big sources of authority, then look at what the book argues was the original model, where revelation was everything. After that, we'll get into the massive debate between reason and narration, see how they dealt with some tricky contradictions, and finally, explore how the Hadith school came out on top. All right, first things first. To really get what this is all about, we have to understand the 2 main players, the 2 core sources at the heart of this entire discussion, the Quran and the Hadith. And right here on this slide, you can see the central tension the book is built on. On one side, you have the Quran, a single divine book considered the direct word of God, all completed in that first century of Islam. But then on the other side, you've got the Hadith. And that's not one book. It's this vast, sprawling collection of literally thousands of reports about what the Prophet said and did, and it was compiled over hundreds of years. This difference is the launchpad for the book's entire argument. So let's rewind. What was the original setup according to this analysis? Well, the argument is that in the beginning, the model for authority was incredibly simple and direct. Divine revelation, or wahi, was the ultimate source, and the Prophet Muhammad's role was to be its faithful messenger, period. The book really builds its case by pointing to a specific pattern you see in the Quran. The community would ask the Prophet a question about, new moons or charity or fighting, and his response, as commanded in the text, starts with the word say. The argument is that this isn't just a turn of phrase. It shows he wasn't giving his own personal take. He was literally waiting for God's answer and then delivering it. And if you want the ultimate example of this, the source points to the famous Ifk incident, the terrible slander against the Prophet's wife Aisha. This is presented as the absolute proof. I mean, think about it. This was a huge personal and political crisis, but the Prophet didn't just step in and pass judgment. No, he waited for almost a month until divine revelation, the Nur Surah, came down and proved her innocence. For the author, that action speaks louder than anything else. So if revelation was number 1, what changed? Well, as the Islamic empire just exploded in size, it started facing all these new problems, legal issues, administrative headaches that just weren't explicitly covered in the Quran. This created a kind of vacuum, and it kicked off a huge, fierce debate about how to fill it. And this sparked one of the biggest intellectual battles in Islamic history. You basically had 2 camps. On one side, the Ahl al-Ra'i, the people of reason, who said, hey, we should use our minds, our scholarly opinion, to figure out new laws. But on the other side, you had the Ahl al-Hadith, the people of Hadith, and they were adamant the only legitimate source besides the Quran was a direct, explicit text narrated from the Prophet himself. And this quote right here from the scholar Ibn Hazm just perfectly captures the mindset of the Ahl al-Hadith. Their principle was absolute. If a narration, a text, existed on a topic, then human reason had to take a backseat. The author even calls this idea the paralysis of reason, whenever it came face to face with a text. Okay, but here's the thing. If you're going to build your whole system on thousands and thousands of narrations, you are going to run into a problem. A big one. With that many reports, collected by different people over centuries, well, contradictions were bound to pop up. And to show how scholars dealt with this, the book brings up this absolutely fantastic, kind of quirky example, the question of whether or not ghouls are real. So you see the pickle they were in, right? On the one hand, you have a hadith that seems to say flat out, nope, no ghouls. But then you have this other detailed story where the Prophet is basically giving a how-to guide for catching a ghoul that's stealing dates. So what do? You can't just throw one of them out. The texts are both considered authentic. Well, the solution was a really sophisticated intellectual tool called tahqiq. And the name literally means seeking a way out. It was this whole method of interpretation designed to make conflicting reports work together. The goal wasn't to prove one was right and one was wrong, but to find a clever way to make them both true, maybe by saying they apply to different things or that one has a hidden meaning. So we've got this epic showdown between Team Reason and Team Narration. How did it all end? The source argues that the Hadith school didn't just win on intellectual grounds. Their victory was sealed by a powerful 1-2 punch of politics and massive popular support. Politically, the whole game changed. In the early 9th century, the state was actually on the side of the rationalists. But then, smack in the middle of the century, Caliph al-Mutawakkil comes to power and does a complete 180.
He flips state policy, stops the persecution of the Hadith scholars, and throws all the power and money of the state behind them. This was a huge turning point.
And this top-down political shift was supercharged by this incredible support from the ground up. The poster child for this movement was Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the great champion of the Hadith school. I mean, get this. When he died, the source cites accounts that claim up to 2.5 million people showed up for his funeral in Baghdad. 2.5 million. That's just a staggering show of public devotion.
And after he died, his legend only grew. His authority was cemented by all these stories of miracles that started to circulate. Stories about his clothes miraculously staying on during a public beating, about his prayer shirt surviving a fire, even about sacred hairs from the Prophet Muhammad himself being sewn into his clothes. These stories basically elevated him from a respected scholar to a saint-like figure.
And so, in the end, the victory was complete. The whole paradigm flipped on its head. As Ibn Hanbal himself put it, the Prophet's way of life, the Sunnah, recorded in the Hadith, wasn't just a secondary source anymore. It became the ultimate authority, the main lens you had to use to even understand the Quran. The original hierarchy was completely inverted. And this brings us right to the book's final lingering thought. By walking us through this massive historical shift from relying on revelation and reason to the absolute dominance of narrated texts, Tarabishi leaves us with this really big, provocative question, one that goes way beyond this specific history. What happens to any civilization when one way of thinking wins so completely over another? What are the long-term consequences when one intellectual door is shut?